degrees. It's 46 degrees right now in Charlotte.
This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. For years, in fact, since their inception, social media platforms have operated like the Wild West with very few rules. It meant that people could post any comments they liked on any topic and pretty much get away with it. On occasion, some posts would be taken down by unseen arbiters, but that didn't seem to stop the steady stream of comments that, prior to the advent of social media, would have been considered unacceptable and only spoken in the shadows. Following last January's insurrection at the Capitol, however, Twitter removed the President of the United States from their platform, one he used with abandon in the years leading up to and during his presidency. Twitter banned for life the tweeter-in-chief because they feared he would use them to further incite violence. Trump was suspended from Facebook for 2 years as well. And other high-profile posters have been removed from various platforms. The result has been a 73% decline in mis- and disinformation on social media. Some see that as a vindication of this controversial decision. Others say it is an infringement on free speech rights. Which side is right? Is it more important to allow anyone to say anything to everyone, true or not? Or does truth matter? Should social media be a place where one can foment unrest? Or should such actions be viewed as much the same as we would treat someone for falsely screaming fire in a crowded theater? We look into that this hour with Shannon Bond. She is tech correspondent for NPR. She joins us from the West Coast. Good morning, and thank you for getting up early to be on the program. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Nandini Jammi is co-founder of the Check My Ads Institute, an independent watchdog that says it is reshaping the digital ad tech industry from within its ranks and defunding the insurrectionists. We'll talk about how they're going about that, but thank you for joining us. Welcome. I just want you to know you're muted, so you have to
I
turn
am on
your mic
mute.
on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you. It happens almost every day. And Dr. Shannon McGregor is assistant professor at the UNC Hussman School of Media and Journalism and senior researcher for UNC's Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Thank you for joining us too. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Shannon Bond, let me begin with you. Aside from Donald Trump, how many people have been deplatformed, removed, told they can't use various social media platforms in recent years, and primarily for what reasons have they been removed?
I mean, it's hard to quantify. There have been these big sweeps, especially as platforms like Facebook and Twitter have cracked down on things like the QAnon conspiracy theory, right, and on militia and extremist groups, but also definitely, on some of these more high-profile figures. Of course, not just former President Trump, but other, prominent right-wing influencers. We've also seen during the pandemic, a crackdown on people spreading misinformation about COVID and about vaccines. So I think, at this point, depending on how you want to define it, it's certainly, in the thousands, tens of thousands, but it gets a little messy once you get into the details of some of these different groups. But largely we have seen the big platforms kind of finally, after years and years of taking a very hands-off position, saying they don't want to be the arbiters of truth, finding that there are areas where they have to draw lines. And they have started to draw those lines, as I said, around things like health misinformation and claims of election fraud. And so they put these policies in place. Of course, the question always comes down to how are they enforced? How evenly are they enforced? And that's what really animates people, frankly, on both sides, who think it's right what they're doing and that they should do more, and people who claim that this is a form of censorship.
And Dr. McGregor, as Shannon Bond, we have two Shannons on the program today, so I'm going to call you Dr. McGregor. As Shannon Bond was talking, it sounds like a lot of the people who have been deplatformed, either permanently or temporarily denied access to their various platforms, it sounds like much of that involves people on the right side of the political spectrum. Am I right or wrong about that? And if so, why just the right? Are there not people on the left who perhaps are saying things that are incendiary in some way?
Yeah, I mean, Shannon's right in that we have seen, especially when we look at sort of the deplatforming of influential individuals, including the former president, that it has been more on the right. But at this moment in our politics, it is folks on the right who are spreading more misinformation, both about COVID and other health measures, but I think, also about threatening our democracy, right? And spreading sort of the big lie around the election. And in fact, there are lots of people who are in positions of power who are still using their platforms to spread that sort of electoral misinformation that have not been deplatformed. And so I think the reason that we're not seeing it as much on the left is because there's not as much supply of misinformation in those two realms, where, as Shannon pointed out, the platforms have been keen to, after a long time not doing anything, actually finally do something sort of about it.
Perhaps, Nandini, the central problem here with whether or not we should regulate the use of these platforms is the fact that many people view these platforms, and in fact, the platforms themselves will tell you, we're like the phone company. We're not the New York Times. We're not NPR. We're not CBS. We just provide a platform, an outlet for people to post whatever it is they want to communicate about. Phone companies, however, make their money because they bill you every month for the use of their service. Social media is free to the user, and they get their money from advertising. And you say that for over a decade, quote, this $400 billion industry has acted with no oversight, no regulation, no consequences. And you also call this a surveillance advertising industry, which we'll get into. But are you more concerned with the fact that there has been little regulation about how they use the data they glean from us, or about the advertising that goes to support the ability of people to post anything at any time without oversight? Which scares you more or concerns you more?
Well, to be fair, both of those things concern me, but the thing that concerns me immediately, that is the most important thing that we need to worry about, is that the biggest voices in disinformation are funded by advertising. And more specifically, it's by advertisers who are unwittingly funding that content. It's happening without their knowledge. And it's happening because an entire opaque advertising ecosystem, a supply chain of advertising exchanges and agencies and data brokers are working together to place ads across the internet, and basically hoping that they don't get caught placing their clients' ads on some of the most unsavory corners of the web.
How do you know that's the case? How do you know there is malicious intent there? Because advertisers will often rely on media buyers in the conventional media to just mass buy. They'll say, I want men 18 to 36 or 18 to 24, 18 to 35, whatever, who smoke or have a dog or who recently bought a house, and I want to be on the platform, be it a cable television station or a radio station or a newspaper outlet or social media that has those eyeballs. There's no malicious intent involved there. There's simply, I want those people.
That's right. There's no malicious intent involved, and particularly marketers such as myself. I come from a career in tech marketing, and I had, of course, a basic understanding of how programmatic advertising worked back when I first got involved in this line of work. I myself ran my first Google ad campaign, and I did what I later learned is quite a rare thing to do, which is looked at my site placements. I wanted to see, I had a very small advertising budget, and I wanted to see how it was being spent. I was curious to see if it was being placed on CNN or the New York Times or Slate or any of the outlets that I was reading at the time. And what I found instead was that my ads were not being placed on those sites. They're being placed on websites I'd never heard of, websites that that didn't even look like real people visit. And I distinctly remember my ads appearing on and this was before, pre the word disinformation, but I found my ads appearing on conspiracy theory sites. And that was the first time I realized, this is not a conversation that's happening in marketing. People are not talking about this because I don't think people are aware of the problem. So what's happened is over the years, marketers have handed over our marketing budgets to ad tech companies without even realizing that their ads could be placed on these types of on conspiracy theory and disinformation and hate sites, because that was just not even a concept that entered our minds, because what we're doing at the end of the day is optimizing for our own performance and conversions and sales, and the idea that our ads could end up funding an unsavory or disinformation site. It's just not even in the realm of, was not even in the realm of possibility until we started to talk about it.
We'll talk a little bit more about the implications and the impact of that as we go through this hour. Those who object to individuals being deplatformed, particularly when Donald Trump was deplatformed by Twitter and Facebook, Shannon Bond, were extremely upset by this, and they threw accusations of censorship at those platforms. They say it was a violation of the former president's free speech rights. Was it?
I am not a constitutional lawyer or law scholar. However, I mean, basically, no, that's incorrect. The First Amendment, protects people from having their free speech rights infringed by the government. These are private companies, right? I mean, they're publicly owned, but they are private companies. They get to set the rules of the road. And actually, the ironic thing to those kind of claims is that, in fact, the First Amendment protects companies like Facebook and Twitter in the decisions that they make. They don't have to let anybody write anything. It's their website. They can decide. They can say only people named Mike are allowed to post on Facebook, and only write about Charlotte. Like, they can just set any sort of arbitrary rules. There isn't this right of free access. I think what has driven that kind of confusion is that these companies do come from this, this kind of very open attitude towards the web, like that the web is this great equalizer, that it is this kind of democratic open square where everybody can speak, and they have advertised and promoted themselves that way. But the truth is, any reputable website that takes user-generated comment has rules, because otherwise we see what happens. Like, we see what happens on the internet. Things devolve into a cesspool.
So Dr. McGregor, Facebook, Twitter, other platforms like that have often been compared to the public square. They've, as Shannon Bond just said, they've also been compared about not unlike having a conversation with your neighbor over the backyard fence or at a backyard barbecue. But you can choose not to speak to your neighbor over the backyard fence, or you can simply walk away from somebody you've invited to your backyard picnic who is espousing views that you don't agree with, or not invite them the next time. Isn't this exactly the same thing? Can't you just not be on that platform as a consumer of that platform? Why should the platform decide that that person shouldn't say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think Shannon is right in that. I think there just is a lot of confusion about the way that free speech laws apply here. And certainly we could opt not, to listen or engage with certain people. But in the same ways that we have power differentials in real life, offline, there are power differentials online too, right? And so not everyone has the same amount of power. So me opting out is not the same as the president tweeting something that is sort of hard to opt out from seeing. Even though, minority of Americans are on Twitter, some of the research that I've done has shown how, in particular, Donald Trump's tweets, but of course, other politicians, amplify out through the media system. So, his tweets were, reprinted in stories or shown on TV. And so even if you were opting not to be on Twitter and not to see what he or anyone else was saying on Twitter, you would still see it in other news media outlets. And so that's not really a good solution for that.
Shannon McGregor is with UNC Chapel Hill. Nandini Jammi is with us, co-founder of Check My Ads Institute, and Shannon Bond, a tech correspondent for NPR. We will continue our conversation in a moment. Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Heartwood Tree. Winter trees allow for more careful examination of tree structure. Heartwood Tree Services arborists can recommend long-term goals ahead of the spring thaw. Consultation at heartwoodtree.com. And Tyndall Subaru Gastonia, featuring the new 2022 Outback with performance, technology, and design updates throughout. Details at tyndallsubaru.com and on Facebook at Tyndall Subaru. Tomorrow is Friday. That means the local news roundup on this program at 9. Rising COVID cases are starting to clog area hospitals as the federal government launches an effort to get home tests and masks to folks. Our state's primary will now be delayed until June. First it was March, then it was May, now it is June. City Council has made some zoning decisions for parts of the city, and here's arguments for more changes. And after a snowy weekend last weekend, more snow in the forecast for this one. Those stories and more tomorrow at 9.
Hey y'all, this is Tommy Tomlinson. This week on the Southbound podcast, I talked to Jason Mott, whose novel called Hell of a Book recently won the National Book Award for Fiction. It's a funny, tragic, and surreal story about trying to process the far too common violent deaths of young Black people in America. You can find this in every episode of Southbound on Apple Podcasts, NPR One, and WFAE.org.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about the impact of social media on our politics and on our social lives, and also the impact of removing people from these platforms and what that means, whether it's an infringement on free speech or whether it's censorship or whether it's something that ought to be done. Shannon Bond is a tech correspondent with NPR. Nandini Jammi is co-founder of Check My Ads. We'll talk about how the intersection of advertising in these websites plays a role in all of this. And Dr. Shannon McGregor is with UNC Chapel Hill as the Hussman School of Journalism and Media professor and researcher for the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Dr. McGregor, it isn't just fringe thoughts or hate speech and outright lies that have a home on these social media platforms. It is the algorithms that help them float to the top. And you have said that hate speech is actually rewarded on platforms like Facebook. This was certainly true prior to the 2016 election. Is it still true?
Yes, it is still true. You know, that type of speech is something that is protected by the free speech. Is not necessarily something that has to be welcomed by the platforms. As Shannon pointed out earlier, they have the right to prioritize or deprioritize whatever type of content they want. I think what's really troubling, though, is that there was a lot of, hate speech and harassment and mis and disinformation prior to 2016, and there wasn't as much attention to it. It was only after that impacted, the broader public, and I would, sort of point out sort of the moderate white public through, election interference from Russia, that this became something that we were talking about. For a long time, people from traditionally marginalized communities have been subject to hate speech and harassment and targets of mis and disinformation on the internet. And so, I'm sad that it took 2016 for us to pay more attention to it. But I am glad that we're paying attention to it, because I do think it's important to think about, who is being targeted. And I think the other thing that's really important to think about is we focus a lot on the content of this, right? Hate speech, it being mis or disinformation. I think what's also really important to focus on are the producers of this, right? Who is creating this type of content and why? What do they stand to gain from it? An obvious example that we can think about is President Trump, right? Spreading disinformation about the election so that he can retain power and try to stay in office, right? That's a clearer case. But I think when we think about it as us as individuals looking at this content that we see on social media, instead of, I think it's important to think about the accuracy of information that we see, but I think it's also important to think about, why am I seeing this, right? And why is this being prioritized to me through these algorithms? And sort of the tip that I try and give people is like, if it makes you really angry or if it makes you feel really good, that's a cue to like maybe just take a pause, right? Because you're seeing it for that reason.
Would I be right in saying, Doctor, that these algorithms are politically neutral? What they are not neutral about is the fact that they skew toward causing the cream, which would be the more clicks, more eyeballs, to rise to the top, whether it's to the left or to the right.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And so what is engaging continues to rise to the top. And what we know motivates engagement is outrage, right? Things that make you mad or angry, or things that make you feel really good about yourself or people like you.
So, Nandini, Yes, Nandini.
You got it.
Let me ask you about this. Facebook is very sophisticated in its use of algorithms because they're a big company and they've scientifically researched this thing to an nth degree. But these fringe sites that you referred to that have gotten in the way of perhaps our politics, do they have the same kind of algorithmic sophistication, or how is that impacting? How does that work? How does it compare to Twitter, Facebook, and other sites?
So I think the question that you're asking is, how have these fringe sites been able to leverage platforms like Facebook and Twitter? Well, they're pushed up by the algorithms because they produce the type of stories that Dr. McGregor just talked about. And what they do then is develop a community on Facebook, keep their audience returning, keep their audience loyal. And what's more important is that they push their audience towards their own websites. So when you see those top 10 Facebook pages, usually they are those outlets that traffic in outrage and conspiracies. They are pushing millions of people and millions of clicks to their own outlets on the open web. And that is where they cash in. And when I say cash in, I mean they place ads. So when you go click on that site or go click on that article that makes you feel so good or so bad, that is designed to optimize for or maximize their advertising revenue. You'll see that each of these pages and each of these articles, as you scroll down, is plastered in display ads and video ads and hidden ads and like all sorts of sponsored content. And all of this is done through programmatic.
Dr. McGregor.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in and say that another way that they've leveraged, that some of these sites have leveraged Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms, is creating like dozens of, Facebook pages or Facebook groups or Twitter accounts that have different names, but all push to the same website. So you may be a part of one community, I may be a part of a different community, but we're seeing the same information and it's pushing us to the same sites. And I think another thing, when we're talking about power and who's creating this sort of disinformation, money is power, right? And so that's another reason to be critical of some of this, is like, why is it driving me to this site? I think we have to continue to pay attention to the grift of all of this.
Let me play devil's advocate, because I agree with everything that you just said, but there are those who do not. And these platforms, Shannon Bond, are not journalistic outlets. Facebook is not a journalism outlet. Neither is Twitter. Neither are some of the other ones that they point to. They're not publishers of content. They merely provide an avenue for content to be transmitted. And their argument has been they are not responsible for the content on their platforms. But now that some of them have decided that certain kinds of posts are simply not good for them or for the society at large, and they have banned the producers of that content, have they set a precedent for themselves? Have they now de facto admitted a responsibility that puts them more into the arena of publishers?
I think they kind of always had this responsibility. From the beginning, these sites banned things like child pornography, right? Child sexual abuse content, terrorism content. That stuff predates, the issues that we talk about that kind of really came to the fore after 2016. So kind of all along, they have always had rules, right? I think just now the rules feel to us more political because there is so much political disagreement. What I think it's at this point in sort of where we are, in our sort of society-wide grappling with the role of these big platforms, what I think is maybe more valuable to focus on is, yes, of course, there is the question about like what are the actual rules of the road? What kind of content decisions are these platforms making? But I think there is beginning to be a shift that I think is really good towards not talking just about what particular posts are they leaving up or taking down, what particular accounts are they banning, but focusing on the architecture, focusing on the algorithms, because what is, I think, indisputable that the platforms have responsibility for is what are they choosing to put in front of you, right? Like, people may be putting posts up on Facebook, but if you're on Facebook long enough, you follow a lot of pages, you follow a lot of people, there's a lot of content they could show you. How are they deciding what to show you? what are they deciding to prioritize? This is this question of what are they amplifying, right?
But
And I think that's really valuable.
But you work for NPR, which is a qualified, curated news organization, the New York Times, CBS, any major mainstream media is a curated operation where editors, producers, sometimes show hosts make a decision about what they're going to cover, what they're going to report on, how much time to give it, how much weight to give it, how often to repeat it, et cetera, how deeply to explore it. They're gatekeepers, self-appointed gatekeepers. What's the difference?
That's right. I mean, we don't see that these platforms have those kind of editorial roles, right? And so those decisions are being made in the way that Dr. McGregor described, by algorithms where the incentive is not about, is this, do we think this is going to be valuable to somebody because it is, going to inform them better or make their life better? It's literally about, is it going to keep them on Facebook longer? Am I going to keep scrolling? Am I going to interact with this? I'm much more likely to interact with a post if it outrages me or if it makes me really excited. And for all the reasons we've talked about, that's how you can end up really validating.
I'm going to come to Dr. McGregor in a second, but not at NPR because it's not an advertiser-based service, but network television, certainly cable news, the way they promote certain news stories is a form of clickbait, isn't it? They're going to put the news that they think is going to make you watch or listen at the top of the heap, whether it's that important or not.
I mean, yes, that is true. I mean, we all have these. I think all these companies have these kinds of incentives here. I think the difference on social media is that ultimately they aren't creating the stories or the posts, right? That their users are, and that has allowed them this arm's length difference. And so I don't think we can say they're exactly the same, but I certainly think you can argue that they should take more responsibility than they are taking.
Dr. McGregor.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. First, to the differences, I think that this conversation shows how tenuous even journalism is, right? The reason that these other outlets that you're talking about are different is just because we have this thing called journalistic values. And in this country, we have, thought of, the fourth estate, right? And part of upholding democracy is having a strong press that does the sort of things you're talking about. But most of our press is commercially funded and also has to make money, right? And so that has always been a tension in the model of the press that we have, most of the press that we have in this country. And I think what we're seeing with social media platforms shows just how tenuous that is, right? It's just because these producers are not going too far, many of the mainstream ones, that we're not having these same sorts of discussions, because in the end, they do need to make money and they are commercial businesses. And so I think this shows, the tenuousness of that a bit.
But we're all grown-ups, allegedly. Can't we discern for ourselves what's real, what's not real, whether or not things are being exaggerated? I mean, there are some people who believe that tweets and Facebook posts, particularly from high-profile people like a president or a congressperson, should be out there because we should have a right to know what they think and what they are saying so that we can decide whether or not, as a voter, we're going to vote for them again or for the first time in the first place. Distasteful or not, incendiary or not. These posts shed light on the beliefs of these politicians. Should social media platforms allow people like the ex-president or like Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene to say what they want and allow followers to decide for themselves about the quality, the value, the accuracy of their comments?
I think no. I think that, as we talked about earlier, these social media companies have the right to prioritize or deprioritize whatever kind of speech they want. And I also think when it comes to, some of the people that you're talking about, these companies as, actors, and I would say getting close to institutions in this country, have a right to prioritize and a responsibility to prioritize democracy. And so when the speech of political actors in particular is disinformed and specifically around their own electoral accountability, then I think that it is fine and good for social media companies to prioritize the democratic function, which is not allowing lies that undermine somebody's own electoral accountability. And I think that's a pretty bright line that we can draw and that we have seen platforms draw. And I think that it's also important to remember people are overloaded with information, particularly now we're heading into year 3 of this pandemic almost, and people are overloaded with time. There's not enough time to do anything. There's so much information. To ask people to view every single tweet and Facebook post, particularly when it comes from people who are powerful with like a deeply critical eye, I think that's a huge ask actually for everyday people to do all the time in the middle of everything else that's going on. And so in these extreme cases where people who are elected are using these platforms to undermine their own electoral credibility, that's asking a lot of people.
We're going to go to Nandini first and then to Shannon Bond. Nandini, you wanted to jump in on this.
Dr. McGregor, I co-sign everything you just said, and I just want to add that we got to remember that these platforms are vehicles for advertising. They're data mining platforms. They're not a vehicle for free speech. They're private corporations. So at the end of the day, these platforms may not be answerable to users because we are not their customer, but they are answerable to the advertisers that place ads on them and that require what we call brand safe environment to reach their customers. And we all know what happens. We all saw what happened last summer with the summer of 2020, because it's 2022 now, but the summer of 2020 when the Facebook ad boycott started, and that really was the first time that it became clear that advertisers, there was a grassroots movement that made advertisers aware that they need to be answerable to their customers at the end of the day. And that is what pushed that, what fueled that boycott, that boycott against Facebook was advertisers trying to do right by their own customers. And that's us, that's the people, that's us on the ground, consumers.
Shannon Bond.
I was just going to say, when it comes to thinking about, should they let should they just be, allow any politician to sort of say anything for the purpose of the public being informed? I mean, truthfully, first of all, these politicians have multiple platforms, right? Just because they are not allowed to post on Facebook or Twitter does not mean they can't get their message out there. And I think again, kind of going back to like, how do traditional journalism outlets treat this sort of thing? And people are not reporting on what Marjorie Taylor Greene or former President Trump say, but in a news story, you're putting that into context. You are in the kind of, even in the moment, most responsible journalists, I think, trying to establish some basis. Is what they are saying true? Here's what if it's not, here are the facts that would counter that. What happens on social media is, there is just so much information that can be awash, and everything is flattened, right? Everything kind of looks equally credible or equally incredible. And I think it can just be much harder. And then I think also because of the scale of the reach of the platform affords in general, and especially for these very high profile figures, I mean, there's a real argument that they have a greater duty of care to the users when to allow somebody like that to reach such a big audience.
I mentioned at the very beginning of the program that the deplatforming of the president on Facebook and Twitter resulted in a 73% reduction in false information, disinformation being broadcast on these platforms. I want to find out what the upshot of that was when we come back. It's Charlotte Talks. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Blumenthal Performing Arts, presenting What the Constitution Means to Me, the boundary-breaking play that breathes new life into our Constitution and imagines how it will affect the next generation. February 15th through 20th at Night Theater. More at blumenthalarts.org. Last night, Democrats, surprisingly, lost the latest fight over the filibuster and a federal voting rights bill. After hours of passionate debate, the fate of the legislation was sealed in a slim 52-48 vote. What does this mean for the future of voting rights, and what does it say about how things get done on Capitol Hill? We'll be talking about that in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A, and we'll continue our conversation about the impact of social media and what constitutes censorship versus free speech rights and more when we come back in 30 seconds. Stay with us.
Your world, we help you explore it.
NATO has just wrapped up talks with Russia in Brussels.
It's your community. We help you understand it.
This week, Superintendent Ernest Winston offered the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board a blunt assessment of current conditions.
WFAE's Morning Edition is an essential way to start your day and stay connected to your world. Weekday mornings from 5 to 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. So little time, so many questions left to talk about social media and deplatforming and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We're talking about it with Dr. Shannon McGregor, senior researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at UNC Chapel Hill. Nandini Jammi, co-founder of Check My Ads Institute. We'll talk a little bit more in this segment about exactly what they do and how they do it. And Shannon Bond is here. She is a tech correspondent for NPR. And let me ask about the 73% reduction in disinformation on Twitter and Facebook following the deplatforming of the former president. Was that a big deal? I mean, yes, it led to disinformation reduction on those platforms. Did it have any impact on society at large, Shannon Bond?
I mean, I think it did certainly, to some degree reduce some of that misinformation on those big platforms. There have been other things that have popped up as well, and we can talk about sort of, to the degree the platforms are still enforcing in the same way. But I think what really happened with especially some of these high profile deplatformings is of course people went elsewhere, right? There's this whole universe of alternative tech platforms that have popped up, places like Parler, long existing places like Gab. Even former President Trump is apparently in the process of trying to set up his own social network that have very much marketed themselves as places that are welcoming to people who've been kicked off the mainstream. And so, I think if you're ever trying to approach something as like we should remove bad things from the internet, like that's never going to happen. The question is, is it reaching fewer people? Are people less likely to be drawn down a rabbit hole on these big mainstream platforms? And I think there has been some success there, but I think, I would love to hear what Dr. McGregor thinks. I know she studied this.
And I know you want to comment on this, Doctor, but let me add something to the equation as you comment on what Shannon Bond just said. And that is, since we're all in these silos and echo chambers of our own making, that we seek out information that conforms to our preconceived notions of how we view the world. If you deplatform somebody from Twitter or Facebook, and there are alternatives like Parler, et cetera, don't those people just go to those platforms to get the information that they would have gotten on Twitter and Facebook?
The evidence suggests for most people, no. Most of these high profile figures who have been deplatformed are not able to keep their reach on these smaller, more alternative platforms. So while the diehard fans, may indeed follow some of these folks to their other platforms, many, many, many people do not. And so that's one of the ways that deplatforming, is successful in terms of stemming that tide in these mainstream platforms. But I think, one of the downsides is from, a shared research and journalism perspective, it can also make some of this information harder to find. Some of these smaller platforms, they're publicly accessible, right? Like I have accounts on some of them so that I can, try and keep an eye on what's going on. But they are harder in some ways to like programmatically access if you're trying to like gather large amounts of data, say for like a research project. And also, they're horrible sort of places to be on, right? And so for all the complaining that I think we do about like how awful Twitter is sort of this like everyday sort of journalism joke, to try and follow some of these folks on places like Gab or Parler can be, a pretty bad experience. And so I think, sometimes it means some of that information doesn't see sunlight as often.
Nandini, your organization, Check My Ads Institute, believes consumers don't want advertisers to fund disinformation. But I'm wondering if that is really totally true, given the fact that we do live in these silos and that there are people who at least in this country, know better, but who continue to spread the big lie about the last election and insist that limiting voting is actually protecting voting rights. So don't people who subscribe to those worldviews or the information that I just described, don't they want as much disinformation out there as possible? And there are some commercial concerns who would fall into that category of wanting to spread that disinformation.
That's right. There's probably some. I'm sure what you're saying is true, but
My pillow.
there you go. My Pillow is single-handedly propping up so many disinformation outlets today through affiliate marketing. But what we know for a fact is that advertisers overwhelmingly do not want to be on disinformation sites, websites that promote racism, xenophobia, misogyny, transphobia, and other forms of hate. And we know that because in 2016, I was behind the campaign Sleeping Giants that first began to alert advertisers that their ads were appearing and therefore funding Breitbart. And as a result, 4,000 advertisers publicly told us that they did not want to have their ads on that website, that they repudiated this, and that they were taking actions to block the website from their media buy. Following that, over 30 ad exchanges dropped Breitbart as well. And the result of that was that within 3 months, Breitbart lost 90% of their ad revenues. And that
What does
was
that mean? What does that mean
$8
to a
billion.
site like? What does that mean to a site like Breitbart? What impact has that had on them?
The impact that it had was right after the elections, Breitbart was gloating and they were publicly talking about expanding their operations into France and Germany to replicate what they had just done in the United States. And by the way, that strategy was, and this is a Steve Bannon quote, flooding the zone with shit. And they planned to create that level of chaos in France and Germany ahead of their elections, and they were never able to do that. They were kneecapped by our efforts to demonetize them. Dr.
McGregor.
Yeah, I mean, I want to jump in and say I think this is super important, and I think it's important to think about it from the public perspective and thinking about what type of policy or regulation that the public might want. I've worked with, over the last year, the Knight Foundation and Gallup together to do a 10,000 person survey on people's attitudes about technology and about democracy. And one of the things that we find is that a lot of people are really concerned about targeted advertising. You know, if you ask folks about targeted advertising, on social media, people have in general sort of negative feelings about it, right? They're worried about it. They think it's had a negative impact on, our society. But I would just push back, and this is what I've been, trying to say in some of my public writing and research, is it's not that targeted advertising is the problem. It's the way targeted advertising is being used and who is using it, right? Like some of these disinformation sites that Nandini is talking about. Targeted advertising, allows both me to get the fancy towels that I want, that Instagram knows that I want. It also allows, small campaigns and challengers and new people entering the political scene to be able to, enter that scene at a lower cost. So it's not the targeted advertising itself that's the problem, but it's the way that it's being used and the fact that there's no sort of guardrails around how it's being used to push people to these disinformation sites.
Nandini, no matter the success that your organization has had and continues to have in your efforts to inform advertisers that they're on platforms that they may not want to be on, and then they hear that, they find out that it's true, and they remove themselves, do you feel like you are spitting into the wind? Because the big dog here is still Fox News, and they are supported by advertising revenue, and they are not some fringe website. They are the major cable news network.
Well, yes and no. I have been behind efforts to basically make Tucker Carlson a nonprofit TV show. He's lost all of his national advertisers after campaigns that we ran at Sleeping Giants, and we also contacted advertisers back in 2017, I believe it was, when Bill O'Reilly's when allegations of his sexual misconduct at work came out, and he no longer has a job. So we've to some extent had a very high degree of success with Fox News. But what remains, the challenge remains in sort of helping advertisers understand that Fox News is a source of disinformation and not opinion. And we need to, what our sort of job at Check My Ads is to really make it clear that we're talking about issues that go beyond the political spectrum. We talk about the impact that they have on not just the public. Let's not just think about it in terms of the public, but their own customers. So if you have people who are out there who are putting out rhetoric about, that promotes misogyny or racism, that kind of rhetoric affects your stakeholders, your employees, your customers.
But the bottom line is still the bottom line. Yes, these the managers, the executives in these companies have a responsibility to the shareholders to make as much money as they possibly can. And if advertising on Tucker Carlson works, despite whether or not you agree or disagree with his political point of view, wouldn't you be better served to keep that advertising there? That's number one. And number two, a lot of people don't understand that not all of the commercials you see on any of these cable stations are coming from the cable networks themselves. They are local breaks for the cable companies and satellite companies that put these on their service. And you're talking about having to talk to local advertisers, not just national advertisers, about their support of these various programs. How do you do that? And once again, are you spitting into the wind?
Well, frankly, we don't focus on TV. That's why we focus on digital advertising. And so,
but by focusing on that, are you having the impact that you otherwise might have if you went after the big dogs?
Well, I want to remind you that we're a 3-person company. So we're a 3-person company. We launched 2 months ago, but we are very focused and we are very strategic in how we take on the campaigns that we take on. We take on fights that we believe we can win. What we do is, when a few years ago, we started by targeting advertisers and letting them know that their ads were appearing on Breitbart. And that meant we had to go to every single advertiser. We had to, we created a grassroots movement to contact every single advertiser individually. And that was a little bit ridiculous looking back on it, because the real problem here is that the ad exchanges are allowing anyone and everyone into their inventory. So we have, Google is the biggest monetizer and funder of disinformation. So what we do now, rather than just go to advertisers who we know already don't want to be on these websites, we go to the ad exchanges and we say, hey, you have publisher policies and supply policies in place that are meant to protect the brands that you claim to support, that you work for, and we need you to enforce those rules. And those rules often are protecting advertisers from content that promotes all the things that I already mentioned: racism, misogyny, content that promotes harassment, abuse, as well as misleading stories and narratives. So a lot of these ad exchanges should not be allowing this inventory, this new inventory. And some of again, some of these are Facebook top 10 pages. They should not be monetizable inventory. And that's what we do at Check My Ads. We remind those companies of their responsibility to advertisers.
Shannon, do you want to comment further on that?
I was just going to say, I think it's really valuable when we're thinking about the role of advertising, of course, in bringing in the big TV players as well. But I think that is also actually true in all of this conversation about disinformation and content policies and deplatforming. I think just focusing sort of on social media alone misses the larger picture. What is happening on Facebook and Twitter, and it is very much tied to not only these other right-wing online outlets like Breitbart or others, but also to Fox News. This is not, they're not sort of separate. There's a continuum, and you see that in terms of how this disinformation, kind of flows across, which also gets at some of the, these real questions of how effective is it for any individual company to act when there's this whole ecosystem here where this stuff is spreading.
Since these platforms are largely unregulated and also seem to have more power than any entity in the history of society, including governments in some cases, is it dangerous to give them the power to deplatform anyone, or is it their responsibility to police what is on their platforms and take action? Where Shannon, is the fulcrum?
I think that is the kind of what we are struggling as a society to decide. I think the companies themselves are very uncomfortable with that role, right? We've heard Mark Zuckerberg talk about this. We heard Jack Dorsey when he was leading Twitter, talk about not wanting to be in that role of decider. And I don't think a lot of the public wants these unelected executives. But I also don't think we want like a department of misinformation in the government. I mean, there is this question, like who plays that role? Facebook has tried to get at that with their oversight board, which is this Facebook funded group of outside experts that is kind of weighing in on its biggest decisions. But just at scale, that doesn't really apply, right? How do you do that in a site that has, billions of users? So I think that, I mean, sorry to throw this back at you, but I think that actually is the question. I think that's what we are grappling with, and we don't have a good answer to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is right. No one is comfortable. Again, this survey that I mentioned, we find that overwhelming agreement among the American public that the American public wants some sort, that the government's not paying enough attention to what the issues are in technology and the power and size of these technology companies. But there is, of course, disagreement on what should be done, right? Whether the government should play a role in it or not. I think, though, that any type of regulation, whatever it is at least responsive to the public, right? In a direct way. If we don't like the regulations that are being implemented or the way they're being implemented, then we may use our voice at the ballot box to show that. Right now, we would have to, have a mass exodus from Facebook. People have called for that. It hasn't happened. And for many people, particularly those who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, Facebook is the internet. And so it's not really fair to ask them to be responsible for it.
Dr. Shannon McGregor is an assistant professor in the Hussman School of Journalism and Media and senior researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at UNC Chapel Hill. Nandini Jammi is with Check My Ads, and Shannon Bond is with NPR. Thank you all for the hour.
Thank you.
Charlotte
Thank
Talks
you.
with Mike Collins is a production of 90.7 WFAE.